Thanks for staying with News at Prime. Some good news for South African consumers whose backs are against the wall because of the forever rising medical prices. The price increase of medicines will be capped at 4.53% for 2020. What does this mean for the health sector and manufacturers of medicine? I'm joined in studio by the spokesperson of the Pharmaceutical Task Group, Stavros Nicolaou. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you. Good evening.
It's certainly good news.
Me.
Thank you so much for coming. It's certainly some good news, isn't it?
So, look, I think a 4.5% increase is inflationary linked. And I think it presents fair value between keeping medicine prices accessible to consumers on the one hand. And on the other hand, pharmaceutical businesses are like any other businesses. Their expenses increase. In fact, they increase beyond 4.5%. But I think if you can at least inflationary link the increase, then it does strike that balance between access to medicines for consumers and patients. And on the other hand, it keeps businesses viable because it allows them to cover their overheads. So I think we welcomed as the Pharmaceutical Task Group, the PTG, which represents over 90% of the pharmaceutical industry in South Africa. We welcomed the announcement by Minister Zwane earlier this week.
And in practical terms, what will this mean to a consumer who is going to be now buying medicine either over the counter or, of course, via prescription? How much of an increase am I going to feel when I actually go and purchase medicine?
So, Bongiwe, that's an excellent question because this price increase pertains only to the private sector. It doesn't cover the public sector. The private sector covers around 17% of our population. So it affects 17% of the population. And in that 17%, around 90% of those patients are medical aid funded. And the other 5 to 10% are what we call out-of-pocket or cash-paying patients. So 4.5% is inflation-linked. It's probably what most funders, medical schemes, medical aids, etc., would have budgeted in any event. But I think what it does do, most importantly, it does keep medicine prices accessible to consumers.
And I know that you say that it affects those that are in the private sector. But, what's going to happen then? Because I know that obviously the public sector government does come in there to make sure that there's enough medicine and all of that. But we have seen some medicine shortages as well in the past. And how's that, going to then possibly, because I know you're saying it's not going to be affected, but how then can we curb such shortages in the future? Because if we're capping the price here and we're ensuring that those consumers are able to have somewhat of a relief, then how then do we then ensure that we don't run out of medicine in the public sector?
Look, medicine shortages are a very complex conversation because the cause of medicine shortages is multifactorial. There's 4 main reasons why you get medicine shortages. Let me try and very quickly cover them. The first is there's a constant requirement to upgrade the quality standards of medicines. So you need to keep investing in your quality standards and your compliance.
Does that affect generics?
It affects all medicines across the board. So that very often means that you have to apply to the regulator, which is called SAHPRA, the South African Health Regulatory Products Agency. You often have to apply to them for a change of an active ingredient or a change of a manufacturing site. And very often there are delays. There have historically been delays with SAHPRA. SAHPRA is a new entity. It is reconfiguring itself. It is addressing some of the backlogs that you're experiencing in that respect. So that was probably the single biggest reason why you had shortages. The second is managing demand and supply and often not getting it right. The third is often manufacturers themselves run into demand and supply management issues. And then the fourth issue is sometimes products are no longer viable for the marketplace. So in other words, they're no longer economically viable and they have to be withdrawn from the market. And it's also another reason why manufacturers would look at accessing more cost-competitive manufacturing sites, for example, which goes back to the regulatory issue I spoke about earlier. But those are really the 4 areas. There are a couple of others, but primarily those are the 4 areas we need to work on. And certainly the new reconfigured SAPRA, which is the successor of the Medicines Control Council, is pivotal, and I think strides have been made in addressing some of those regulatory issues to lessen the impact of stockouts and shortages.
And this cap comes at a time when the South African healthcare system is undergoing some kind of a change with the NHI coming in. Will that affect it at all?
Look, I think, NHI is more a medium-term picture, and then we've got to live with the now. There's issues right now that we need to be addressing in the healthcare system. So there was a presidential health compact that was signed earlier this year between all healthcare stakeholders and the presidency. And I think those are contained in that compact are some of the areas we need to be addressing immediately. And one of those is to ensure that we have sustainable and consistent supply of medicines to consumers. There's nothing worse than having a patient controlled for chronic disease, and then suddenly you run out of the particular medication. That is disruptive. It can cause problems. It can cause side effects eventually if you start switching patients. So all around, having a sustainable, economically viable and robust industry is critical to ensuring security of supply of medicines.
And how do we ensure then that the industry stays robust? Because the issues around shortages and supply and all of that are not new. They're issues that have been there for quite some time. And as you rightly put it, sometimes it does get affected by the fact that, some of these manufacturers are not putting in the change, as you say, in the product in time. How then do we, ensure that the industry stays robust and consumers are not finding themselves shortchanged here?
So look, I think the robustness of the industry relates to the ability for the industry to recover its costs, recover its overheads, and also to, it is an industry that is required to make some profit, obviously. And, with that profit, you're able to reinvest back into manufacturing, back into new products, future pipelines, etc. So it is important that you are able to strike a balance, like I believe we have this year, on this 4.5% announcement, because it does allow industry to start recovering its overheads, which is critical. If you start going with very low increases, like 2 years ago we had a 1.2% increase, that places the industry under strain, because there's no business whose overheads haven't grown more than 1.2%. I mean, regardless of which sector you're in. So I think this year Minister Zwane Mkhize's announcement is a fair and balanced one. It's a more transparent one. But most importantly, it's a timeless one. Because we've also had delays historically where these announcements only happen in February or March. And, if you lose a quarter or 3 or 4 months of the increase and you only get 1.2%, it has quite a negative impact on the industry. So getting the single exit price dispensation done fairly and timelessly is critical to the ongoing sustainability of the industry. I should also mention that as you correctly pointed out, this is a cap. That means you can't exceed the 4.53. It doesn't mean that where there are particular products or molecules or therapeutic categories, where there is a lot of competition, you might find some manufacturers only might take a 3% increase. They might not take the 4.5%. So the full impact to the consumer is not necessarily the 4.5%. But in any event, 4.5% is linked exactly to inflation over that period that was under consideration.
And do you get a sense, from this, because I know that increases were capped in 2019 at 3.78%, and then now we're seeing this 4.53%. Do you get a sense that in the coming years we're going to be seeing a cap that is fair between yourselves, and of course ensuring that the consumers are not hardest hit as well? Or do you think that we'll still continue to see some of those numbers fluctuating? They're even going as low as 2.1%, making it difficult for yourselves?
So look, I think the conversation we've been having with the minister and his team is precisely that we need to strike that balance in society. You can't go too high and you can't go too low. You've got to strike that balance. I get a sense with the way it's been approached this year that we might have with future adjustments, because they're called adjustments, I think you might have an inflationary linked type of scenario playing out, which I think presents that fairness that I keep speaking about. Of course, there are situations that are out of the ordinary. So, you know, in 2008, for example, when the rand crashed, the rand went to over 18 rand to the dollar. It went up from roughly, I think it was about 11 rand to 18 rand. I mean, that's staggering. So there are exceptions both ways, up and down, that you need to look at. But generally, what industry has called for and discussed with the minister and his team is an inflationary-linked increase moving forward, because that's the reality that both consumers experience on the one hand, but also businesses on the other hand.
With this cap, could we see some increase in the spend when it comes to medicines?
So, you know, the interesting thing is that medicines are about the only sector that is regulated, medicines and medical devices. And they first became regulated in 2004. And it's interesting to follow the trajectory of medicine spend as an overall percentage of healthcare spend. So in 2004, it represented 23% of private sector spend. It has now declined to around 15.5%, 16%. And that trajectory remains flat. So it's showing you that the regulation has worked, because it's brought down medicine pricing as a percent. I'm not saying it's the only reason. There's also been increased consumption of generics. There are other reasons. But fundamentally, the legislation has worked, and we've seen a significant drop in medicines as an overall percentage of healthcare spend in the private sector. That is a trend we continue and we expect to continue into the future.
Well, thank you so much, Stavros Nicolaou, there, for coming through to talking to us about this particular cap and, you know, some of the effects that it's going to have. And thank you. I know that you took your time from your favorite soccer team's match, which has just gotten underway, Liverpool. But I certainly hope, you know, that we can talk about this some more in the future, because, you know, consumers continue to be cash-strapped. Thank you so much for that. Well, we continue after the break. Pelasandi Sikwaba is also standing by to bring you the latest from that soccer match, where we know that Sundowns is also playing, and of course we'll bring you news from further afield.